Thank you so much for everyone for coming here today for what I believe is one small part of one of the most important conversations that can be happening in our world today. Nuclear weapons are not just one issue among many. They are the thread that runs through every other global challenge that we face, whether we are talking about climate, poverty, health, justice. None of the goals can be fully realized in a world that continues to live under the threat of nuclear catastrophe. The existence and modernization of nuclear arsenals must be included in every conversation we have about sustainable development, peace, and the future of humanity, which is why it is my absolute privilege to welcome you here to this event. Thank you so much for coming. And today we are absolutely honored to have three of the most distinguished guests in this field. We have Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Richard Falk on Zoom, and Dr. Ivana Hughes. Now I know these leaders need absolutely no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Professor Sachs is the university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He's president of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network and co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. He has been special advisor to 3 United States Secretary Generals, United Nations Secretary Generals, and currently serves as the SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Please welcome Professor Sachs. Next, please.
Okay. Anastasia, thank you so much for organizing this, and thanks to everybody for coming to have a discussion about, indeed, the most important topic, because it's the topic of survival of the planet, which is definitely in extreme peril. I'm sure everybody here knows the doomsday clock, which I regard as a pretty accurate reflection of where we are. The doomsday clock is the graphic representation of how close we are to disaster in the world. And at the beginning of the year, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the second hand 1 second closer to 89 seconds to Armageddon, 89 seconds to midnight, which they define as cataclysmic risk. The cataclysmic risk that they principally identify as nuclear war, but we've got a lot of risks now because nuclear war and environmental catastrophe and AI catastrophe and others are all wrapped up together. I think they were pretty conservative in just moving the second hand 1 inch closer, 1 second closer, because it was at 90 seconds to midnight last year. And I think we're heading towards doom a little bit faster than that. Ivana, whom we'll hear, who is a brilliant leader in this field of doing something about all of this, said something that I unfortunately disagree with. She said we were smart enough to invent the atomic bomb, so we're smart enough to control it. And I just want to add one unfortunate footnote, which is that some of the world's greatest geniuses in the context of World War II invented the atomic bomb and then handed it over to some of the stupidest people in the world. And that's our problem, which is if you know senior government officials in the US government, you cannot sleep well at night. I'm not just talking about the current president of the United States, though that would be enough to keep you up all night anyway. But I'm talking about, in general, we're not well governed. The stupidity is immense. If these people had been at Los Alamos, we'd be breathing more easily because they wouldn't have even been able to draw the picture, much less to make the bomb. But they have in their hands an active nuclear arsenal of 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons in the United States, and of course, up to 6,000, some supposedly not actively deployed, and many countries around the world with the equally irresponsible or even worse leadership, also nuclear armed at this stage. So 89 seconds to midnight seems to me to be, in one sense, an accurate summary, but maybe a little too optimistic, I'm sorry to say. Today, I would say there are 4 imminent places in the world where nuclear war is not only imaginable, but not even unlikely. And it just takes one nuclear use that could set off the chain reaction that ends everything, as Annie Jacobsen brilliantly and terrifyingly showed in her book, Nuclear War, A Scenario, which everybody should read and shudder through to understand how fragile the whole situation is. So there are 4 places in the world today where if a nuclear bomb was used, you wouldn't be surprised. The first is between India and Pakistan. Now, India is mobilizing to attack Pakistan. It seems real. This is after a terrorist attack in Kashmir last week. And you have 2 nuclear-armed nations that don't talk to each other, don't have any normal relationship, don't have trade, and don't have an iota of trust, with an explosive situation and an imminent mobilization right now. And as I was walking over, I was listening to the account of one of the senior Pakistani diplomats basically pleading with Russia to help mediate before everything gets out of control. So that's case number 1. Case number 2 is Israel, which is nuclear armed and the worst government in the world, an outright murderous regime that is slaughtering people and threatening a war against Iran. Not only killing innocent Palestinians in huge numbers, but threatening to attack Iran, which has a security arrangement with Russia as of the beginning of this year, and has hypersonic missiles and other powerful weapons, though not a nuclear bomb, but enough to create disaster. And Netanyahu is a war criminal and could very well, under certain conditions, use nuclear weapons. I have no doubt, because he's ready to slaughter people in mass numbers and has done it. And I don't think that there's any rational limitation in the Israeli regime right now, which is a completely rogue regime, in my view, completely lawless and out of control and murderous. So that's number 2. Number 3 is Ukraine. Ukraine, the war ain't over. And there are attacks by the Ukrainians every day trying to make incursions into Russia in a reckless, I think, suicidal and provocative way. And Donald Trump, in this case, is actually trying to dial down the crisis, but the Europeans are displaying how utterly reckless they are as well, including some of the 2 of the nuclear armed countries of Europe Britain, if you listen to Keith Starmer, it's also terrifying. He's a fool, and he is absolutely goading and provoking Russia, which also has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons and 6,000 nuclear weapons overall. And Britain has been actively engaged in actually fight, basically shooting missiles deep into Russia, because, as you know, Ukraine is pressing the button on the missiles that are striking deep into Russia, but all of the programming, the tracking, the logistics, and the weapons themselves are British or American or French. And so basically, the US, France, and Britain are bombing Russia, which is not a good thing to do. It's an insane thing to do. It's insane that this war is going on even one more day. But the British, despite Trump trying to find an exit ramp to this, tries to escalate. And so does France. Macron, the same way. So Ukraine remains a place where we could, I was going to say we could wake up to see the end of the world, but we won't wake up from it. We could experience the end of the world in Ukraine to this day. And by the way, our genius officials, who I thought were just about the worst foreign policy administration we ever had, the Biden administration, I dislike them all, by the way. I just think that they're blundering fools that lead us. I have to say, I have no admiration at all. I think they're reckless, and they're putting our lives at risk in a completely reckless way. When the war continued in 2022, when it could have ended, by the way, in April 2022 at the negotiating table, but the United States told the Ukrainians, fight on, because that's the U.S. way of diplomacy is war. They told them to fight on. In the fall of 2022, when Russia was losing some territory, Putin was saying, you know, if things go wrong, we are going to use nuclear weapons. The fools on our side said, "Oh, don't be bluffed and don't be blackmailed by Putin." But the internal assessment was that this could be up to a 1/3 probability of Russia's use of nuclear weapons around September to November 2022. Shit. Are you kidding? And these idiots telling us don't worry about it, they don't tell the truth at all, and they gamble with the survival of the planet in the most reckless way. So that's number 3. And number 4 is in East Asia, where the U.S. continuing rhetoric and talk and planning is for war with China. Another unbelievable, completely misguided idea. China is no threat to the United States of anything except a nuclear war. And the idea that we should be having a war with China for any reason in the world is so wrong-headed, so much based on bigotry and ignorance. It's completely inexcusable. And yet it is the mindset in Washington. And the mindset in Washington, for instance, yesterday there was an article in American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-wing Washington so-called think tank, though that is the biggest euphemism imaginable. But in any event, the title was, "Can the U.S. win the Cold War with China?" This is a sentence that is a meaningless sentence. What does it mean to win? What is this Cold War? Where did it come from? Who announced it? Why are we in a Cold War with China at all? Because the American mindset is if you can't crush the other side, they're your enemy. And so suddenly we're in a Cold War with China. Now we have to win, whatever that means. And China has hundreds of nuclear arms, not quite as many as the United States, but it doesn't take more than one or two to ruin your whole day. So the idea that they're behind a few hundred nuclear arms is a meaningless idea. And there's a real chance of war. It's just one slip, one accident, one statement by a Taiwanese leader that goes wrong, that leads to a spiral, to a confrontation over Taiwan. And stupid American leader says, we will defend the island, and China says it's ours. And it's easy to paint a picture of this going completely out of control. So that's 4 out of 4, and I'm just talking about the start of all of this because Annie Jacobson's book, as you know, starts with a bolt out of the blue, a single fire from North Korea. That's the scenario. And that's perfectly possible also. So the truth is, we are not in good hands. Military doctrine makes no sense. They're faking it as they go along. We don't even know if Biden was compos mentis for the last 2 years of his government, truly, because there's plenty of evidence that he was incapable of being president of the United States for a significant amount of that time. But we live in a PR world where you don't even have to acknowledge if a president isn't in the right mind, because everything's a game, everything's an illusion, everything's a PR cycle. And Biden would have probably run the whole time had he not been forced that 5 minutes away from a completely prepackaged debate so that we saw the real truth of his incapacity last year. So this is my summary of the situation. It's not a happy one, I'm sorry to say. The crises are too large. The mindset of this country is too reckless, and we're not alone in having a completely reckless mindset. And all of those crises that I mentioned could spiral out of control. The main lesson of all of this is don't trust human beings with such destructive force. We're not up to it. We need to disarm before we kill ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for that incredibly chilling account of the current state of affairs. We will try to get into some more discussion about possibilities for the future in the Q&A session, but before that, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ivana Hughes to the stage. She is the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and a senior lecturer in the discipline of chemistry at Columbia University. She holds a BS with honors from Caltech, where she studied chemical engineering and completed her senior thesis with Professor Frances Arnold, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry. First American to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry. The first American woman to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Dr. Hughes obtained her PhD from Stanford University, where she was an American Heart Association pro-doctoral fellow. She has been a faculty member at Columbia University since 2008 and was awarded the Lenfest Distinguished Columbia Faculty Award for 2020. Her work on ascertaining the radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands has been covered widely, and she currently serves as a member of the Scientific Advisory Group to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN, a committee consisting of 15 experts from around the world who advise the states parties on scientific issues as they pertain to the treaty. I'm sure she will give you all a rundown of the treaty. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Ivana Hughes.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, for the kind introduction and really for everything you did to make this event possible. I have to say that I'm so honored to be speaking alongside Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Professor Richard Falk, from whom you will hear next, and he's joining us virtually on Zoom. These are really, both of these people are just such a huge inspiration to me, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with everyone. Some of you in the audience from Columbia might know me as a scientist, so I'm going to kind of stick to my scientist hat today and just talk a little bit about what it is that nuclear weapons are and what they can do to our world. You sort of hear all these statements you've heard from Anastasia and Professor Sachs so beautifully about these weapons truly being an existential threat to our world. So I want to really just highlight why nuclear weapons are so special, what makes them so different from really anything else that we have, that we humans can do to our planet. We can do plenty of damage to our planet and the environment, but this notion, Professor Sachs mentioned Annie Jacobson's book, that we could destroy the planet and the world and the civilization as we know it in 72 minutes. It quite simply doesn't happen with anything else that humans can do. There could be an asteroid that hits our planet that could cause that kind of damage, and more or less. There could be a supervolcano. These are things that happen on, naturally on timescales of millions of years and so on. But we humans could, in the course of this event, it could happen that in 72 minutes, the world quite simply disappears. So if I could have my friends over in the back, just go to the next slide, and then we'll quickly go. Can you move to the next slide? Yes, and we'll quickly go. I'm going to tell you why nuclear weapons are so bad and what makes them so special and so dangerous, but then I am going to give you a little bit of hope. And I'll respond to Professor Sachs that it's not so much that I think we're smart enough to do it. It's we are capable of doing it because it's a human-made problem that humans can solve. Climate change, a different kind of problem. It's very complex, right? It's not like we can make a single political decision and just solve climate change today. Nuclear weapons, we could make a single political decision to eliminate all of them. And that would be the end of this threat specifically. So if we could have the next slide, please. So I have, why are nuclear weapons so different really from everything? And I'm going to just give you a rundown. I have a few things I want to highlight. So if you could press next, please. So we first have this sense of scale, and I just want you to get a sense for what it means to use something like a chemical explosive or a conventional bomb versus using, and not just the kinds of bombs that were used in attacks on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the kinds of bombs we developed after World War II. So up at the top, no, please don't move until I tell you. Go back to sense of scale. Yes, thank you so much. So the first image, the two images on top are of a building called a federal building that was in Oklahoma City that was attacked in a domestic terrorism attack by someone named Timothy McVeigh, who filled a Ryder truck with chemical explosives. And that was the equivalent of 2.5 tons, 2,500 kilograms of a chemical explosive. And that attack destroyed the federal building, destroyed buildings in a 16-block radius, killed 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare center in the building itself. And so it was absolutely devastating. But that was 2.5 tons of TNT, of a chemical explosive. And the image that you see right underneath is the image, of course, that people have seen before of Hiroshima are being absolutely flattened, destroyed, devastated by the atomic bomb that was used. It was actually detonated above the city. And that explosion was the equivalent of 15,000 tons, 15 kilotons of a chemical explosive. It didn't have a chemical explosive. It was a nuclear bomb that works on the process of fission, but the equivalent energy that it produced was 6,000 times larger than the energy that was used in the Oklahoma City bombing. And so now it's not surprising that instead of just destroying one building and some radius around it, killing on the order of 100, 200 people, this explosion actually killed on the order of 100,000 people and destroyed, flattened an entire city. And then the image at the very bottom is of an explosion that took place in the Marshall Islands in Bikini Atoll. This particular detonation was called Castle Bravo, and it was using a different type of nuclear weapon called the hydrogen bomb that works on the process of fusion. So fission is where atoms split and create, or nuclei split and create two new elements, two new atoms, and energy is released that way. Fusion is a different process. It's the process where atoms or nuclei come together and release energy that way. And it's actually the process that takes place in our sun. It's why we actually have energy on our planet, why we have a livable planet. So fusion is not all bad, but fusion as a matter of destruction and bombs is very, very bad. That explosion that you see at the bottom was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb used in Hiroshima. 1,000 times, 15 megatons, 15 million tons, or 15 billion kilograms of TNT. Absolutely unimaginable. That mushroom cloud you're looking at is 25 miles or 40 kilometers high, about 60 miles wide. So an absolute monstrosity. So just the sheer amount of energy the nuclear weapons can produce is absolutely unlike anything else that we can do. So now next bullet point, please. So, it's also what happens to that energy that makes nuclear weapons special. And that's this notion of a blast, the kind of blast that can destroy, again, cities or whatever else you're targeting for, depending on just how large the explosion is, it can go on for literally miles where everything is flattened. There's heat. The nuclear bomb creates a fireball. And again, depending on how energetic the bomb is, that fireball could be a mile across. It could be even more. Everything inside the fireball is evaporated, disappears, the way that a drop of water disappears if it goes on top of your stove, right? And then there's radiation, and there's sort of two different things with radiation. One is that there's initial radiation that's produced initially when the chain reaction and the fission or fusion happens. But the other is that in the explosion, radioactive isotopes, if we could have the next bullet point, please. The radioactive isotopes that are produced can then be sources of radiation for either short or long periods of time, depending on what isotopes we're talking about. And so something like iodine-131 has what's called a half-life of 8 days. That means that the initial amount after 8 days becomes a half, and then another 8 days, it becomes a quarter, and so on. And so it reduces, iodine-131 will disappear from the environment in a matter of weeks. It's the kind of isotope that actually accumulates in people's thyroid, and it's why so many people who either were exposed in Japan or actually very, very dramatically during the period of nuclear testing. Many of the survivors of those tests suffered from illnesses of the thyroid, including thyroid cancer. And then there are the longer lasting isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90, which are actually very interesting. Cesium-137 behaves chemically like potassium, and strontium-90 behaves chemically as calcium. And so when they're in the environment, plants actually take them up, literally, thinking as if they were potassium and calcium. So these radioactive isotopes get incorporated in the food, then humans eat them. And when you ingest something that has these radioactive isotopes, that's this internal exposure that can then now the radioactive decay that produces gamma rays and other type of radiation is happening inside your body. And that can be really, really detrimental. And the strontium-90 being similar to calcium results in cancers like leukemia and bone cancers. That's where calcium is found. And then the cesium-137 is related to cancers of soft tissues, things like the brain and muscles and so on. So if we could have the next bullet point, please. So there's one other thing that can happen when you have a single nuclear weapon that gets exploded. And this is exploded under very specific conditions. A high energy bomb that gets exploded very high in the atmosphere can produce something called the electromagnetic pulse, which can literally shut down electricity in entire countries. You can use a nuclear weapon, not even kill anyone deliberately through the explosions, but you can create this electromagnetic pulse that can shut down entire societies. I want you just to think about it. And this is not the kind of situation where it's a 3-day or a week-long blackout and then the electricity comes back. It is not coming back. And I just want you to take a moment and just think, what would our world look like? What would our society look like if we had no electricity and it's not coming back? If we could have the next bullet point. And so Jeff alluded to this, that we have thousands of nuclear warheads. It was one thing in 1945 when we had 3 nuclear weapons. The U.S., quote unquote, tested one in New Mexico and then used 2 in attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today we have on the order of 12,500 nuclear weapons in the world. And so the idea is that those probabilities Jeff was talking about in fall of 2022, it wasn't just, what we're not worried about is just that one weapon. It's the worry is that it's one weapon and then the whole, as you referred to it, the chain reaction starts and we're in a full-blown nuclear war. And so I want to just highlight 2 things that happen that scientists have known. Actually, the first one, which is called nuclear winter and nuclear famine, was studied first in the early 1980s, but more recently we've had far better climate models that actually show us that it's far worse than the scientists even thought in the early 1980s. And the idea is that if you attack cities, if you produce all this fire, you also produce soot that goes up into the atmosphere, blocks incoming sunlight, and temperatures begin to drop very quickly. And as they begin to drop, things stop growing. And essentially, food stops to grow, agriculture begins to fail. And the estimates are that over 6 billion people out of the current 8 billion alive on the planet would die of starvation within the first 2 years. And so it's this, a completely different planet. In a absolutely devastating result. And then the second thing that's been known actually since the 70s, and one of the first people who brought this up was someone who passed away late last year, Mal Ruderman, who was a professor of physics here at Columbia. And it's the issue of the production of nitrogen oxide, nitric oxide, and other compounds that would actually destroy the ozone layer. And again, simulations that are more recent suggest that under scenarios where, for example, the US and Russia use about 1/3 of their current nuclear arsenals, and that's where I quoted the 6 billion number for the starvation, over 70% of the ozone layer is destroyed. So this is not a planet on which, even if you're down in New Zealand and maybe food is still growing and it's not as cold as, it would be up here. It is not this is not a planet you want to be, living on. And there's actually a quote from the Soviet leader Nikolić Khrushchev, who said, the survivors would envy the dead. So let's go to the next slide. From my perspective, it's all very bleak what I'm telling you, but there have been times in the past where we've made progress on nuclear weapons. One of those times was in the 1960s when actually John F. Kennedy and Nikolić Khrushchev got together after the Cuban Missile Crisis and basically agreed on what is called the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which came into force in 1963 and ended atmospheric testing, ended the kinds of tests that were happening in places like the Marshall Islands and Kiribati and so on. Here in Nevada, there was atmospheric testing going on as well. And the other period of significance was in the 1980s, where contrary to how Reagan started his presidency, and contrary to even the fact that in 1986 is when we actually reached the height of the nuclear arsenals. At that time, I told you today it's 12,500. Back in 1986, it was 70,000 nuclear warheads. So we've gone down, and that was put in motion by Reagan and Gorbachev. In 1986, they had the famous meeting in Reykjavik in Iceland, where they almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons. And sadly, they didn't agree, but they almost did. And for me, the two sort of lessons of the successes in the 60s and the 80s are that you absolutely need two things. You need an engaged citizenry. And we see on the left from the 1960s, that's actually a very famous person on the left. That's Linus Pauling, who at the time was protesting the nuclear testing. He had already been a Nobel laureate in chemistry. And then in 1963, he was actually awarded the 1962 Nobel Peace Prize, thus becoming he was and still to this day, the only person not just to have won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different fields, but 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. Both of his where he was the single person for both his chemistry and his Peace Prize. But there was this outpouring of public concern about the nuclear tests, and that helped push Kennedy, and that helped push us to the Partial Test Ban Treaty. And then the other ingredient in both cases is the leadership at the top. You do need people at the top who care about this issue and understand this issue and don't just pretend like nuclear weapons can be around forever. Indefinitely without destroying our world. So next slide is where I give you just a tiny bit of hope. What I've been saying is that if in 1986, when Reagan and Gorbachev got together and almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons, if we had had a UN treaty, an international framework that could absorb and support that decision, I think we would be living in a world free of nuclear weapons today. I really believe that. So today we have a treaty, and it is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It was negotiated in 2017. It entered into force in 2021, just just in early March, we had the third meeting of states parties. There are currently 73 of them and another 25 signatories. So that's basically essentially half of all UN member states are part of this treaty. It is mostly a global South treaty. And it is a treaty where states are saying that precisely for the reasons that they described, the nuclear winter, the destruction of the ozone layer, that the nuclear weapons in possession of the 9 nuclear weapon states put everybody at risk, and that these states have a stake in this conversation and they demand the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So next slide, please. And I just want to highlight sort of that the treaty prohibits everything having to do, any sort of verb you can think of, develop, test, transfer, use, threaten to use. The treaty prohibits all of these things. And so what people like myself and Timon Wallace here in the front and other people, Veronique Ristori, what we're all working on is one, universalization of the treaty. How do we get everybody to that table? 2, humanitarian provisions. So I sort of alluded to this period of nuclear testing and, of course, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How do we help victims and how do we remediate impacted environments, primarily impacted by radiation? And also, finally, how do we verify that elimination is happening? Those were actually big sticking points in previous treaty agreements, and that's one of the important directions for the treaty and the work of people working on it. So I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ivana, and for ending on a slightly inspirational note. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Professor Richard Falk. He's joining us on Zoom from Santa Barbara. Professor Falk is Professor Emeritus at MIT, at Princeton University, and is the former United Nations Human Rights Rapporteur in the occupied Palestinian territories. Since 2002, he has lived in Santa Barbara, California, and taught at the local campus of the University of California in Global and International Studies, and since 2005 has chaired the board of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, where Ivana is president. The Nuclear Age Peace Foundation was founded in 1982 and currently holds consultative status to the United Nations Economic and Social Council and is recognized by the UN as a peace messenger organization. Richard, handing it off to you.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And let me say at the outset that I wish I could be with you in person, but it's an honor and pleasure for me to share the platform with 2 of our greatest global mentors who understand, I think, the realities of the 21st century far better than our elected leaders, and suggest, as Jeff alluded to, the inadequacy of our governing process and those that are in positions of leadership. Let me focus my brief remarks on the nature of the global order that makes it so difficult to reliably get rid of this planetary hazard that the human species is not equipped to cope with in a sustainable way over long periods of time. And as Jeff also pointed out, there are crises waiting to erupt in ways that could easily be transformed into nuclear war scenarios by irresponsible leaders or by mistaken perceptions and accidental events. The Cuban Missile Crisis should have taught us that we escaped there a nuclear confrontation mainly by sheer luck, not by anything that was systemically rooted in the way global order operates. I think one element that we should address and understand is the ideology of political realism that has characterized the way in which order and national interests are safeguarded and pursued. And the central tenet of that order is that power is what drives history, not law and morality. And if you consider the people that were most influential in shaping American policy during this period of nuclear possession, they were champions of a power-driven global order. Henry Kissinger, Zbig Brzezinski, and Samuel Huntington are probably the most influential and historically relevant personalities, but they were reflecting an underlying ideology that unfortunately is a deeply rooted consensus among the foreign policy elites and these think tanks that have people who are cerebrally intelligent, but are part of a network of beliefs and practices that are terribly destructive and, in a deeper sense, are potentially suicidal. And it's that groupthink structure that makes it very hard for the kind of perspectives that we're presenting here to penetrate the policy-making circles. And even when, as Ivana pointed out, there was the potential for a breakthrough in 1986 at the Reykjavik meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan, it was undermined domestically before it ever had a chance of being acted upon in a politically meaningful way. In other words, Reagan, who was a very popular conservative president, was called in the inner sanctum of policy-making circles somewhat naive about how international relations should be conducted, and that he was not equipped to negotiate a disarmament arrangement of this dramatic sort. So it never, in a sense, that kind of treaty commitment never had the chance of being something that could be realized as a genuine political project. I've often thought that if Germany had developed the atomic bomb before the US did and had used it and yet went on to lose the war, that could have led to a decisive repudiation of nuclear weapons, because you have to take account of the fact that the way the global order is structured represents the interests and the achievements and the values of the winners in major confrontations. The UN itself is not really a war prevention or nuclear disarming organization. It was given a kind of idealistic cover in the preamble, but it was designed to give the geopolitical actors, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, a free pass when it came to upholding the UN Charter itself. The veto made no sense in terms of global security when the 5 most dangerous countries in the world were given the power to exempt their adherence to the veto. So one has to cope with this deeply embedded ideology in most of the important governments of the world, intensified in this period where we have autocratic leadership in almost every one of them. And I agree also with Jeff that 1 second was too optimistic an assessment of the increased danger that the world faces at this point. So, and we have to have a cautionary attitude toward even this idealistic treaty that Ivana spoke of in very clear terms. We have to remember that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has an Article 6 pledging the nuclear weapons states to pursue in good faith nuclear disarmament. But it's been ignored and unenforced, and the non-proliferation is viewed as preventing the non-nuclear states from acquiring these dangerous weapons, but it has had zero impact on the nuclear weapon states. So, and it has zero impact because they privilege deterrence, which is a power-oriented view, that of preventing hostile threats from occurring, including the use of nuclear weapons, by relying on the power to retaliate. And therefore, it doesn't depart at all from this ideology of political realism. And that, if anything, has been reinforced by the kind of disclosures that Daniel Ellsberg made in his book on the doomsday weapon, in which he shows that the war plans that are operative in the US and presumably in the other major nuclear weapons powers are not concerned exclusively with the defensive role of nuclear weapons or their retaliatory use in the event that others stage some kind of attack. Rather, they are cover for war plans, secret war plans, subject to no international scrutiny, that include first strike scenarios and a range of other potential uses. And finally, I would point out that international law in this kind of realist settings of our government and the governments of China and Russia particularly are very much seen as ornamental window dressing that can be ignored. The 1996 Nuclear Weapons Advisory Opinion of the ICJ, which was nearly unanimous in declaring that in general terms, any threat or use of nuclear weapons is unlawful, was completely cast aside by even the liberal democratic states of the West. And so one has to be very conscious of the need that to challenge this deeply rooted ideology of national security and global interests that dominates governments and is endorsed by influential media and to a large extent by public opinion. So one's up against a very formidable set of adversaries in trying to come to terms with this nuclear challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. Now we're going to move into Q&A. I have a couple questions that were sent in from the registration form, and then hopefully we have enough time to get questions from the audience. Hello. So, Richard, thank you so much for such a comprehensive analysis of how, is this on? Yeah. Of how we got to the nuclear weapons world order that we're in today. I got several versions of the same question from the registration form, and people were asking, in the context of the fact that the countries that currently hold nuclear weapons clearly have an upper hand at the negotiation tables. Jeff alluded to this in his speech. There were several countries previously that had nuclear weapons, chose to disarm, or were in the process of developing a nuclear weapons program and chose to halt it. Examples include Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Libya. When these countries see the upper hand that other countries, including Russia and China, now hold at negotiating tables, what incentive do they have to either get rid of the existing weapons they have or to not develop future arsenals? Richard?
Well, I think that that question raises a very fundamental problem, because the one situation where it makes somewhat rational sense to acquire nuclear weapons is when a secondary or tertiary country is threatened in a variety of ways. And the situation of Ukraine and Libya, which both gave up, in the Ukraine case, the actual weaponry, in the Libyan case, a program designed to acquire the weaponry, both of them were subject to, in the Libyan case, a regime-changing NATO intervention. In the Ukrainian case, an attack by Russia. It suggests that these secondary countries are not being prudent when they give up the nuclear option, because that's the only time deterrence works. And the powerful countries that possess these nuclear weapons use them to enforce a hegemonic world order, as the case of Iran currently illustrates, while overlooking Israel's possession of nuclear weapons, in fact, helping Israel to acquire the nuclear weapon. And so one has a problematic situation where weaker countries threatened in their security definitely have a rational incentive, the way the world is organized, to acquire nuclear weapons. Certainly, India would be attacking Pakistan as we speak if both sides didn't have the nuclear weapons in their possession.
Ivana, do you want to add?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. So one is that I would say that the only country that truly gave up nuclear weapons is actually South Africa. So the former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, didn't really have nuclear weapons. They had the old Soviet weapons on their territory. They didn't have the know-how necessarily to keep them up. They didn't necessarily have the funds needed to continue to maintain them and all the work that needed to be done on that. So I think that example is a little bit misleading of saying, oh, if Ukraine had just kept their nuclear weapons, everything would have been hunky-dory. I think that we really have to challenge the actual narrative of nuclear weapons keep the countries that currently have them, the nuclear weapons keep them safe. First and foremost, I just don't buy it. I actually think that in particular, in the case of the United States, the nuclear weapons world absolutely makes the United States vulnerable in a way that it's not vulnerable in a world free of them. So that's just one thought. But if that logic is true, then how could you deny nuclear weapons to everybody else, right? Then the logic should be, oh, then we should all have nuclear weapons because then every country would be safe and then we're all going to be fine. But that's, of course, preposterous. I mean, imagine a world in which all the UN member states had nuclear weapons. We would have blown ourselves up a long time ago. So you sort of, the trouble is, as Richard pointed out, in this Article 6 bargain of the NPT, where we get to, you don't get them, and we will eventually give them up, but then not giving them up for now. We're at 55 years since that treaty came into force, and we have to do something about it because they put all of us at risk.
Thank you. It's certainly would be very scary to imagine a world where nuclear weapons could just be thought of as any other conventional weapon that every UN member state's able to hold. Jeff, I wanted to ask you a question regarding deterrence. You mentioned that when Vladimir Putin drew red lines and indicated that he would consider the use of certain nuclear weapons, should those lines be crossed, the US called their bluff, at least publicly. But isn't the very premise of deterrence that you have to believe that there is a chance that these weapons will be used? Otherwise, if you think that no leader is willing to use these weapons, then deterrence doesn't work. So how does deterrence play into global security, and in what ways is it sustainable or not?
I think all of the experience shows that these weapons are going to be used at some point. And there's going to be a terrible miscalculation, or you say calling the bluff, but how do we know it's a bluff? Politicians and leaders and generals decide what they think is a bluff and what isn't a bluff. And again, they're not very smart, and they gamble recklessly. And American leaders view the world as a poker game. In fact, Trump uses a poker analogy every day. You don't have the cards, I've got the cards, and so on. Poker is a game of bullshit and bluffing. And so you're not sure whether the other side has the hand or doesn't have the hand. And sometimes you think they're bluffing and they're not bluffing. Oh, and there goes the whole world. Almost everything that we think we know about almost every crisis is wrong. So crisis management is just the most dangerous possible circumstance. And Richard mentioned, and Ivana, how close during the Cuban Missile Crisis we came to the world ending. I think there is something important to understand about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is that both President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were desperately trying to avoid a nuclear war, and they almost stumbled into it. And in fact, and it's extremely important to understand, and an excellent account of it is a book by Martin Sherwin called Gambling with Armageddon. The late Martin Sherwin was perhaps the greatest historian of the nuclear age. And his final book accounts for the Cuban Missile Crisis on a minute-by-minute basis in an absolutely brilliant way. And one of the things that happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis is that after an agreement was reached between Russia and the United States, we almost had nuclear war because there was a disabled submarine which was out of communication. And when it was trying to surface in the Caribbean, a Russian submarine, it was actually fired upon. Instead of depth charges, some idiot in the American Air Force dropped live hand grenades as a fun event. And it turned out that this particular submarine was the only one of the squadron that had a nuclear-tipped torpedo in its arsenal, and the captain ordered it to be fired. And it happened also that there was a senior officer named Arkhipov who had the authority to countermand the order of the captain of the vessel. And he saved the world in the last second. He went home and he was reprimanded for mismanagement and so forth. And the man that saved the world is unknown to the whole world. And this is just yet another irony of how we stumble along until we don't anymore. So that nuclear armed torpedo was actually in the firing bay. It was 1 second away. And under the U.S. military doctrine of October 1962, any attack by a nuclear weapon, including a nuclear-tipped torpedo, called for the complete use of the American arsenal in retaliation, which meant an attack on the Soviet Union, China, and Central and Eastern Europe. The estimates at the time were 700 million dead, but probably the whole world would have been destroyed because of the nuclear winter and so forth. And we had an absolutely insane head of the Air Force named Curtis LeMay at the time, who just loved nuclear weapons and couldn't wait to use them. So that's how close we came. So I don't believe this deterrence business. I believe that we're governed by fools. And that we're going to stumble into a complete disaster. And so what do you do in that context? First, you don't get into situations where you're close to a confrontation of nuclear powers. And Ukraine is an example where we in the United States provoked, in my opinion, for 30 years, Russia, especially by enlarging NATO and overthrowing the Ukrainian government and doing many provocative things, and then saying, don't worry about Putin, that's a bluff, and so forth. Now we're doing the same thing with China. Honestly, whatever you feel about Taiwan, the United States arming Taiwan brings us close to nuclear war, period. You may not like it or do like it, but Taiwan is a cause of war that could end the world if the United States continues to violate China's absolutely clear as can be red lines to stay out of their, as they say, out of their country. And that's close enough for me. Whatever one feels about this. Just a little space between the major powers, please, so that we don't all get killed in a way. And this, I think, is the first order of prudence. And the second order is to get rid of these weapons, which are completely, absolutely going to get us in the end, because we're not smart enough to manage them.
Thank you, Jeff. It is so important to call attention to these close calls and how we can name dozens of them, but there might have been hundreds since all of these documents are confidential. We really don't know how many times we've come to the brink of nuclear war.
We know, by the way, that there were occasions where the birds flew over the radar and they were misinterpreted as incoming missiles. We know another occasion where someone put in a training tape into the monitor, and the station officer saw the incoming attack without knowing that it was a training tape, and called the head of the base and set in motion a sequence for firing nuclear weapons. This is bound to happen. And then add in an AI system, and add in the fact that we have in the U.S. doctrine, the idea is surround your adversary, annoy them to the maximum. We have submarines, they have submarines off our base, and we have submarines off their shores. And so the launch time to take any decisions is seconds or a minute without being able to evaluate. So we'll have an AI system doing it, and ChatGPT will hallucinate at that moment. And that'll be great too.
I don't want to think about that. Maybe next time we have this panel, we should have an AI expert as well to tell us where
just in we could have ChatGPT sitting next door. Don't worry about me.
Before we move into audience Q&A, Ivana, I wanted to touch point on the TPNW. It seems on one hand that global disarmament, or at least partial disarmament to the point where each country has several nuclear warheads, could be decided by a bilateral or trilateral agreement between Russia, the US, and China. On the other hand, with the TPNW, that's a treaty that's really been led by the global South and by countries that have either faced the direct consequences of nuclear testing, which we know nuclear testing is just the use of nuclear weapons. It's not a test, they're just using them and destroying entire countries and communities that are still suffering to this day. How do you balance the responsibility of working towards global disarmament between nuclear havers and nuclear have-nots?
Yeah, so I think, in my mind, the treaty plays a really important role because we can make the case for why the number of these weapons has to be zero if humanities continue, if our children and grandchildren are to have a future. We sort of keep coming back to this idea that yeah, if you just keep running this tape into the future without changing anything, you're going to end up using nuclear weapons. And then if we still have thousands at that point, you're going to end up in a nuclear war, and then you'll end up destroying the planet. So that's really the key point. What I think is important from my perspective, the TPNW is really important because we're not going to bring the whole world again in some kind of other agreement where everybody agrees to eliminate nuclear weapons. Now, the challenge really is how the 9 nuclear weapon states come to that table. And I really think a lot about why of the 9 nuclear weapon states, so US, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France, which are the 5 recognized by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, recognized in some sense by the vast majority of UN member states as having nuclear weapons. And then the other 4 are Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. You want to think about why each country has nuclear weapons. What is the reason why they have nuclear weapons? And so, for instance, India and Pakistan absolutely have them for that regional relationship and for, the conflict around Kashmir. And Jeff and Richard know a lot more about this than I do, but I've spoken with an expert from Pakistan who said there is absolutely nothing stopping us from getting to an agreement on Kashmir that would remove that as an issue. Instead, what we have is this continued militarization and the justification of Kashmir as the reason for all of that militarization, including the possession of nuclear weapons. So in some sense, what you want is bilateral and multilateral agreements that address the source of tension, that address the source, and they go back to this true adherence to international law that Richard talks about, true adherence to cooperation that Jeff talks about so much. How do you be a responsible member of the international community? And so in my mind, the first thing that has to happen is the bilateral between US and Russia. They have on the order of 5,500 nuclear warheads each. And that number is so different from everybody else. China has 500. The others have on the order of 200 to 300. And then India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel less. So the US can't tell North Korea, you have maybe 80 nuclear warheads. We have, nearly 6,000. So you get rid of yours and, we'll just keep our thousands. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. So you have to start somewhere. I think the start has to be US and Russia coming down to some more reasonable number. I'd even be happy with 1,000. Right? Still a lot, could still destroy the world, but it would be far better than 6,000 each. And then you have to, then there has to be a conversation with China, who's sort of the next one with the most. And then I think if the US, now just say this as a kind of an aside, from my perspective, the US has the most to gain from a world free of nuclear weapons because it does have such a strong conventional military. It does have the kind of geography that allows it to be incredibly safe. I think I've heard you say we could be the safest country in the history of humanity. But in a world with nuclear weapons, we're actually vulnerable in a matter of minutes to a country like North Korea, which is very poor, and not a large country at all in terms of population or geographic size or anything. So yeah, it has to be this combination: bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, bringing countries to the table. I'm not a diplomat. Carrots, sticks, whatever it works. We need something, and we need to bring everybody together. And I think I really do admire the countries that have chosen to take this narrative away from just the nuclear weapon states and say that this is their conversation too.
Let Maybe I could add just a word to what Ivana and Richard said. A very deep problem in all of this is the mindset of foreign policy more generally. We had in the Reykjavik meeting, as both recounted, the two leaders pretty close to saying, what are we doing? Why don't we get rid of nuclear weapons? There was one immediate sticking point, which was Gorbachev said, get rid of your missile defense, and then we can do this. And Reagan said, no, we're going to have our Star Wars defense. And that was one sticking point. But the real sticking point was that the U.S. aides got their president and said, what are you doing? This is crazy. So the mindset more deeply was not, oh, let's figure out how to do this. Let's resolve the remaining issues. We can work on this for a day, a week, a month, a year. It was to dismiss it that day as something crazy that we let the two leaders talk by themselves and they came up with something insane. Get rid of nuclear weapons. Can't let that happen. So the foreign policy establishment is dead set against this kind of thinking. And if we go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and its aftermath, just to recount, in 1963, the first major nuclear agreement was reached with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And Kennedy and Khrushchev signed that. And when Kennedy was making the argument for it in June 1963, he had to hide his speech from his own State Department, Defense Department, CIA, and others until the day before he gave it, because he thought the bureaucracy would essentially prevent him from making a peace speech, which he did on June 10th, 1963. And he knew that the pressure was going to come from inside, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from the Pentagon, from the security agency. When the Cold War ended, never ended, it turned out, but when it looked like the Cold War ended with Gorbachev in the late 1980s and in 1990, when Gorbachev dissolved the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet military system of Central and Eastern Europe, again, that mindset that Richard talked about, the realist idea, which is the idea that you're just inevitably locked in conflict. You can't take peace for an answer, basically, is the realist idea. When Gorbachev said, okay, I make peace, the American side said, oh, we get it. We won, you lose, now we'll go make wars. And America launched the most violent series of wars in the next 10 years, starting in Serbia in 1999, then Afghanistan, Iraq, going on to regime change in Syria in 2011, in Libya in 2011, and on and on. And they said, look, Soviets lost, now we can do what we want. Not, oh, now we can have peace. Now we can have war, because we can have wars and no one can resist us. That was the American mindset. I just want to underscore that's what Richard was emphasizing with this so-called realist school of thought. I like many of these realists, and they're very intelligent, very nice people, but I complain, my friend and occasional sparring partner, John Mearsheimer, his magnum opus is the tragedy of great power politics. And okay, if you're reading a Shakespeare play, tragedy's okay. But if you're doing international relations, we can't settle for tragedy. That's the pathology. We need the solution, not the tragedy. And realism doesn't give us a solution. It just preaches that conflict is inevitable because we live in a so-called anarchic world in that realist idea. This idea is not right. It's extremely dangerous. We don't even teach, could you just get along? Could you take peace for an answer? What we teach is, don't ever trust the other side. It's tough out there. It's nasty. If they show weakness, go get them. And I'll just, if I could, just one more minute. There, if you look online, sorry, I don't want to hog the mic, but it just reminded me of something I'd like you to take a look at. 30 years ago, there was a McNeil News Hour, which used to be very popular show in my relative youth, that had a very fine newscaster on PBS, Robert McNeil, and he interviewed Henry Kissinger and Jack Matlock in December 1994. Matlock was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet Union. He's a wonderful diplomat. Henry Kissinger, we know Henry Kissinger. So they debated, should NATO enlarge? And at that point, Russia was peaceful and wanted cooperation, and NATO was supposed to defend against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. So I would have closed the whole thing down. But the U.S. instead decided that NATO would enlarge eventually all the way to Ukraine, to the point of having a Ukraine war. Okay, so in 1994, they were debating this, and Matlock said, of course not. Why should we antagonize the Soviet Union? And Kissinger said, well, of course we should. NATO should enlarge. And the McNeil, the interviewer, said, well, why? Does Russia pose a danger? And Kissinger, no, they're very weak. Well, wouldn't enlarging NATO antagonize Russia? Yes. Well, why would we want to enlarge? They're not a threat, right? No, they're not a threat. Well, why would we want to do it? And Kissinger literally says, if you look at this, well, if you can't antagonize them when they're weak, what are you going to do when they're strong? So the idea is you should always be nasty. If they're strong, you have to be nasty. And if they're weak, you really should be nasty. And that is realism. Always play the aggressive move. Because if the other side's aggressive, you have to. And if the other side's not aggressive, you can take advantage of them. And that, we know, if you've studied game theory, is the prisoner's dilemma that gets you into the war box. That's realism. And then the book about that is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And then we give them nuclear weapons so that that lower right-hand corner box blows up the whole world. No, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's both so disheartening, and yet, for me at least, the reason that I continue to have hope is the fact that all of this, at the core of it, is a mindset problem. Yes, there are all these structural issues that Richard so cleanly laid out. And yes, there will be technical issues such as monitoring and verification, but those are solvable. At the core of it, it's a mindset issue. Now,
exactly right.
Any questions from the audience?
Richard was.
Oh, yes, Richard.
Just really a footnote to what Jeff was saying. I think the problem is that not only that political realism is the reigning consensus among decision makers in the foreign policy domain, but that it's a regressive form of realism that attaches security to power rather than to law. And I think unless part of the mindset problem is the belief that history is shaped by that Kissingerian logic. And so long as that prevails and the voices of this panel are excluded, there's not going to be a change in the mindset. And there needs to be that political traction to shift from regressive realism to progressive and prudent realism. And that would mean getting rid of, all the things that we've been saying.
Absolutely.
Can I just one sentence? And I think that mindset shift has to include moving away from this notion of national security to human security. Our problems are global. We can only solve them if we cooperate. But if we blow each other up and blow up the entire world in the process, none of that is going to happen. So what would it mean for us to achieve human security?
This is why at the beginning, when I did the introduction, I mentioned how solving the nuclear weapons crisis is so critical to climate change and health and justice, because to me, it seems like if we create a framework and a template for solving this, those same relationships, they're just human relationships between leaders, will be able to be used to address those other crises. Celeste will walk around with a microphone, so please raise your hand. We have here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Evelina. I'm a graduate student studying security policy at SIPA. And I wanted to follow up on our last conversation because I see this dichotomy of security traditional policy a lot with this panel. Oftentimes, professors talk about how to operate in the military theater, what to do with the regime change or how to do the regime change. And when I bring up such questions as denuclearization, I'm oftentimes dismissed as being naive. So I was wondering, how do we bridge this gap between traditional security policy and what you guys talked about as at the beginning of our careers, and where do we move forward from that? Thank you.
I can take a stab, and then the others can take it as well. To me, it's really, I think the realist position is idealist in the sense that it's assuming, it's putting a lot of faith in things that we just quite simply know are not going to work out in the long run, right? If you just keep playing, I call it the ultimate roulette, at one point it's gonna blow up. And so I just last week, there's a meeting going on at the UN around this nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And I just gave a statement last Wednesday where I said it's not a realist position to think that the world can, continue in the current status where we have 12,500 nuclear warheads, right? And 9 nuclear weapon states. That's, to me, that's taking in all these assumptions and assuming that we're going to be okay. It's actually the realist position would be to recognize nuclear weapons for what they are and to work towards, as difficult as that may be, to work towards finding a solution for their elimination. And I'll just add one thing. There are experts who say that if this really were about deterrence, then you could get to a point where a country has 10, you need 10 warheads and everyone will be deterred. That's, plenty enough for this notion of deterrence. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think when you have the charge of being naive, there are several responses that are appropriate. One is that the best realist theorist, in my view, is Mearsheimer, and he acknowledges that the logic of his position is tragedy. So if you don't accept tragedy as the outcome, it's not naive to be thinking about alternatives. If you say, oh, okay, realism, yeah, we blow up the world. That's not a great answer for realism. Yes, we have to work on the alternatives, but what we're being presented with is not stability, we're being presented with tragedy. And that's why John is honest about this. He's a very honest scholar. He says, yeah, it's a disaster. He says it's unavoidable. I don't think so. Human beings can cooperate and they can avoid self-destruction. But he acknowledges it's a tragedy. So what's realistic about that? And why is it naive to try to avoid tragedy? It's not naive. So this is one point. Second point is we've been locked in this realist mode for much of our modern history in this country. Has it worked out well? Well, I can name you 10 wars and regime change operations that have ended miserably in the sense they did not produce the outcomes wanted. Millions of people have died. Trillions of dollars have been spent. And you have the great outcome, for example, in Afghanistan, that you go from rule by the Taliban to rule by the Taliban, interspersed with hundreds of thousands of deaths and several $1 trillion spent by the United States. Great outcome. So I think the realists have a lot to answer for in that they have been utter failures for decades in producing security. This country is so safe. It's unimaginable how safe the United States is, other than the fact that we keep screwing up the world so badly that we come close to destruction. So this is a second point. The third point is that if you really take the realism seriously as countries arranging for their security in an anarchic environment, the Professor Robert Jervis, the late professor here, who was a great thinker, said nuclear weapons change everything about the realist calculation. And he called it was known as the nuclear revolution, meaning that you cannot operate according to realist principles in a nuclear age, because that's suicidal. And so even the realists, taking into account nuclear weapons, should behave completely differently. And that was Jervis's point in several books. As a normative matter, he's completely right. As a description of how American foreign policy continued to operate despite the presence of nuclear weapons, he was wrong. It didn't change behavior. It's exactly what Richard has said. The mindset has remained in the United States. So the charge of naivete is all on the other side. They're the ones that have brought us 89 seconds to midnight. They're the ones that have lost the chance for peace. They're the ones that have launched so many useless wars. It's a disgrace. So if anyone tells you that, give them the truth.
We'll collect 3 questions, but we'll answer them at the same time. Maybe we can answer collectively.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for these perspectives. I was actually just at the UN, and we were planting some trees that were transplanted from Hiroshima, planting actually in the food garden at the UN. And it just made me think about how all these game theoretic approaches, they sort of have this implicit assumption of what in economics is called ceteris paribus, like all else is equal. But I was just thinking about the ceremony I was at today and how it is possible to shift the landscape of the world in ways where the conflicts do not have the same logic that they did before. And I wanted to go back to something that was said earlier about how right now there's no talk, but there's also no trade and there's no trust between some of these flashpoints. And so it made me think about, what does that changed landscape look like? Can we think about non-proliferation of poverty, non-proliferation of inequality. Like, how can we connect NPT and the broader non-proliferation process to sustainable development in general? Like, what does that world look like?
Hi, thank you so much for your time. My question was, what do non-nuclear states who are in the crosshairs of nuclear states that have tensions, what is their role in protecting themselves, especially when they're seen as non-insignificant or insignificant by nuclear states? For example, you spoke about potential nuclear fallout with India and Pakistan. What does Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan do to protect themselves when they fall in the crossfire?
Hi, thank you so much. So my question is, during your conversation with the politicians, do you really think it's because they don't know, or is that they're pretending that they don't know, that it's actually better not to use this kind of deterrence or realism, so-called realism way of thinking? And if sometimes it's they're pretending they don't know, is there any punishment or incentive system that you can force them to actually do the right thing? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that is something I wonder all the time. Are they scared of nuclear war deep down? Or is it, if that's just your job, does that somehow get tampered down over time, if that's your day-to-day? So if we could collectively answer those three great questions in our final remarks, let's start with Richard.
Those are good questions, and I can't pretend to give adequate answers to them. But I would say that the greatest naivete is to think that you can live forever with this kind of weaponry in the hands of the kind of governments that are in control of the nuclear arsenals. It is the most historically naive view that shows a fallibility in the way the world is organized that threatens to be fatal, as several of us have suggested. So I think the whole project of some kind of change in the mental outlook, in the state of mind, is to have a political transformation. It's not, and one thing we haven't stressed is the presence of what Eisenhower way back called the military-industrial complex, which benefits from a world of threat and justification of high military budgets and retention of nuclear weapons as an ultimate threat. That's all part of what makes this obstacle of changing the mental outlook sensible. And even a John Mearsheimer isn't welcome in Washington. Despite his realism, it's too tinged with qualifications and this idea that this is people don't want to live out a tragedy. So they don't want that message. They don't want that message from realists. They want a message that this is the best of all possible worlds, and that and they overlook the fact that, as Jeff pointed out, all these uses of military superiority have ended in political failure, starting with the Vietnam War, where the U.S. had complete control over all dimensions of the war and yet lost the war. See, and the notion that you are less secure if you adhere to law and morality than if you have greater military capabilities is what I call the regressive side of realism, that it's attached to something that worked in the 19th century, but began to fail in the 20th and is a disaster in the 21st. So that learning curve of the elites is completely flat and gets us nowhere. And this, the only other point that I would make is that non-nuclear states, as I was trying to suggest earlier, are the only ones, the weak non-nuclear states faced with security threats are the only ones that have a rational argument for deterrence. And that argument, of course, is legitimized by the fact that even the strong states that have no rational argument not only retain them, but have these war plans that allow strategic interests and geopolitical dominance to overtake and suppress adherence to law, morality, and prudence. The other element of what we've been talking about is these people are not only regressive realists, but they're imprudent regressive realists who take on risks that don't serve the national interest. They may serve the interests of Boeing and Lockheed, but they don't serve the interests of the American people or of the democratic societies. But that's the way the logic of the system is now structured. And it's a bipartisan problem. It'll help only marginally to eliminate the kind of leadership that Trump gives. Biden, as Jeff also pointed out, was just as bad on these issues, maybe even worse when it came to Ukraine. He started a geopolitical war with Russia at the expense of the Ukrainian people. And it's a shocking display of governmental irresponsibility and I would call criminality. I see Anastasia looking worried, so
Do you have any concluding remarks, Richard?
Well, I would follow up.
Yes, we'll have both of you.
Are we?
We have a couple minutes to wrap this up.
I wanted to follow up with Richard's point, which I agree with entirely, and to address the question: do they really believe what they're saying? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, actually, to a very large extent. And it's also because of the system pressure and the groupthink, which Richard mentioned. If you look at the actual experiences, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was an absolutely vivid case where we have the recordings of all of the deliberations of the executive committee that President Kennedy organized to deliberate, almost everybody was in favor of war. And everybody was taking imprudent risks, and almost all the information that they thought they had was wrong. All the assessments of how many Soviet troops, whether the weapons were already deployed in Cuba, and so forth. But everybody was ready to go to war, other than President Kennedy himself, and initially one key advisor, Adlai Stevenson, who was the major politician and at the time the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who said to Kennedy, of course, this has to be resolved diplomatically. But he was the only one that said it to President Kennedy at the beginning. Similarly, in 2022, there was one moment where Biden was caught speaking to some donors in California, and he said, you know, we're approaching nuclear Armageddon. And this was in the fall of 2022. And immediately, all the major media attacked him for using such words. How can a president say such a thing? Rather than, oh my God, what's happening? It was, he misspoke. He said, you know, he scared people. He shouldn't use language like that. It was insane to watch how the American system works. We know that behind the scenes they were scared, and he committed what's called a Washington gaffe, which means a moment where you tell the truth. And he, by mistake, told the truth for a moment. He blurted out something that was true. You're never supposed to do that in Washington. But he did it by accident, probably because he was losing his mind. So he remembered the truth, and he forgot that he wasn't supposed to say the truth. In any event, the whole system is designed to repress that worry. You're just not supposed to worry. You're supposed to be tough. You're supposed to send signals. You're not supposed to be weak. You're supposed to be aggressive if the other side is weak. So I think in this sense, it is, as I think we're all agreeing, interestingly, it's the mindset. Now, there are two issues, just for me, last word I want to say about this on the mindset. One is we need to change the mindset by explaining this doesn't work, this is dangerous, this has failed repeatedly, this has brought us to the brink of disaster. So we have to understand all of that. There's a second way to change the mindset also, and that is the demonstrated fact that if you bring people together and they talk, you can actually get more cooperative outcomes than if they're secluded on their team, making assumptions about the evil other team. We don't actually have dialogue among our leaders, almost ever, by the way. It's amazing how little they talk to each other. Even when they come together at the UN General Assembly, it's usually one speech at a time, and maybe there are a few bilateral events that are that happen. But there's almost no systematic opportunity for leaders to sit down and say, what could we do about all of this? And when it happens, you get Reykjavik, you come close. And then the mindset side says, oh, don't let these leaders talk to each other. They could do something reckless like disarmament. And so we really have to change also the structure of the interactions in a fundamental way, because that will improve the mindset. There's nothing like talking to another human being to remember that they're not an insect, they're not an animal, they're not a beast, they're not out to kill you. They have their fears, you have your fears, and bringing people together is actually an amazing way to get people to actually agree on things. And it's just the shock of the world for me, watching this for decades, how little substantive discussion there actually is among leaders, and it's extraordinarily dangerous.
And if I can add to that, I mean, this is really the tragedy of the 21st century, right? You look at this room, and people from however many countries are represented. We can fly easily to any part of the world. We can speak to each other because people learn foreign languages. We can even use ChatGPT, right, to translate for you right then and there, even if you don't have an interpreter. So the fact that we're not talking is really a tragedy. Even I came to this country as a foreign exchange student now more than 30 years ago. It was a very different time. I would call my parents and speak to them on the phone for 3 minutes. Now you can talk to someone on Zoom for hours and it doesn't cost you anything, right? I mean, the monthly whatever subscriptions or whatever you do need to pay, right? But you have it already. And so it's how could we, right? How is it that we're doing this and that we're not talking and we're not cooperating? And just one thought on your question about Washington. At those highest levels, Jeff is absolutely right. They know and they choose to ignore the realities. In Congress, and I do go, Anastasia has actually been to DC with us, they are clueless. They could know, if you tell them, nuclear weapon versus this, like they have no idea what you're talking about. And it's really, really sad. On the issue of the other countries, many of them are actually part of the TPNW, and that's where they're trying to find their voice. I was actually at a meeting that involved diplomats and academics and experts at the end of last year, where someone from India was asked, what responsibility does India have to other non-nuclear weapon states in terms of the fact that they have nuclear weapons? And the answer was very dismissive. Oh, we're a great nuclear weapon state because one, we have a no first use policy, and two, we have a policy of not attacking a non-nuclear weapon state. But that completely ignores what I told you about nuclear winter. The India-Pakistan scenario ends up with over 2 billion people, actually over 3 billion people dying from starvation due to that regional nuclear war that never involves anybody else, just India and Pakistan using their arsenals, right? So the responsibility is a lot more than, oh, I'm not going to attack you, you're going to be fine. And that I think is a big problem. And then the question about, it's Anastasia's opening statement was about how this issue actually interacts with all of these other issues. Nuclear weapons don't just put us at risk. It's something we actively spend a lot of money on, over 90 billion last year, even more. The US is now projected to spend over $1 trillion over the next 10 years to modernize its weapons. This is money that people like Jeff could find a much better use for, right? For sustainable development, for adapting and mitigating climate change, for fighting poverty, you name it. And I'm sure everyone here has issues they really care about. As long as we're spending all of this money just maintaining or modernizing weapons that we're never even supposed to use, it's insanity. It really is.
Thank you so much.